Actually, what I was asked to speak on was human rights and democracy, but from the perspective of the geopolitical changes that are taking place. I will, in fact, draw upon the opening that Sarah gave to us, which is the world is changing. Globalization, the unipolar world has there's been template shifts. In fact, there is at the moment a re-shifting, a realignment, and confusion in the global order. But before I go into that, let me just pull up something else. Very recently, in fact, last week, the Indian Foreign Minister, Jahangir, he was speaking on India-China and the implications of the new developments in China. But he used a phrase, and he said, what is happening and is likely to happen between India and China makes it all the more important that we engage with our periphery. And I put this in quote. Periphery is a very pejorative term. It is, in fact, an imperial term. It is the kind of term that the British used. Your empire, you're the metropolis, and all around you is the periphery. Not really important, but yes, relevant. Now, what does that mean? That means Pakistan is periphery? Does that mean Nepal is periphery? Does that mean Sri Lanka is? Maldives is? Bhutan is? Afghanistan is? These are all South Asia. So it is a very pejorative term. So while at one level, what he's saying is actually important, because he's saying we must be much more serious in our engagement with our neighbors and constructive engagement with our neighbors. But he is still looking at them as periphery. So in a sense, you can almost say it's like a default spin. Without thinking, he said it. But he is, after all, a professional diplomat as well. Now, the reason that it's important, I mean, the term and this way of looking at the region is important is because India is, in fact, crucial, given its strength, its size, its population, its resources. It is, after all, it is, in fact, the lodestar. And therefore the responsibility on India is huge. But if, in fact, its relations, now, last evening, I was having a casual conversation with my neighbor from Nepal. And he said, the real problem is India. And I thought, Nepal's problems are many, they're multiple, but many of them are also internal problems. And yet, there is also a default spin in Nepal that the problem is Indian. Now, even in Sri Lanka, and I have lived in all these countries and worked in all these countries, in Sri Lanka too, I kept getting told the problem is India. But as I was talking to my neighbor from Sri Lanka yesterday, and I asked him, I said, when Sri Lanka went into an economic meltdown just a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, India had given $3.8 billion as immediate aid. At that point of time, the discussions with the IMF were continuing and are still continuing. A great many other countries were also thinking very seriously of extending aid, but they hadn't done it yet. China, too, for whatever reasons, had not extended. So in a sense, it was India that at the most crucial moment for Sri Lanka extended a hand. Now, you've all heard about vaccine diplomacy. It is a fact that we botched it up because we didn't plan on how much the domestic demand would be, and we're making these commitments for a vaccine mantri, vaccine friendship vaccines. And yes, there were to Nepal, to Bangladesh, and so forth. But the fact is that is to do with botched planning, not an exception. But it just shows you that it was considered important, and the critical role that India, if it wishes to, can play. Now, part of the real scare for me is, and I go to a lot of strategic dialogues, is because I find a lot of people are saying, why are we just using soft power? That is, diplomacy, aid, vaccine diplomacy. Why shouldn't we use hard power? I mean, what is this? That Sri Lanka almost, has in fact entered into a very long-term agreement, which has given really almost territorial powers to China and this port, which is near Colombo. And that's the Hambantota port, and their naval warship was about to dock there, and India said, "What? What are you doing?" I mean, they put pressure, and it was delayed. It was not stopped; it was delayed. Now, the fact is, within the strategic community in India, it was said, see, if we'd used hard power, if we'd brought, like the U.S. would have brought the USS, anyway, if the U.S. had deployed its naval fleet, you would have seen how they would have reacted. We should do things like that. So there's a lot of very unsettling thinking going on. But why this all becomes important and important for regional cooperation for us is, the fact is, the international order is changing. It's changing in the sense that, and partly the Ukraine war has reinforced it, the UN system, and the UN system is, after all, what? It's just a system of states. So if the states don't really want to do it, the UN will be weak. Where is the UN in this Ukraine war? Where is the UN when it actually matters right these days? It no longer has the power. It no longer has the influence it has had. And therefore, to look to the UN, even in terms of human rights, even in terms of democracy, it's important, but there is a limit to what they're able to do. There's a limit to what any of the international organizations are now willing or able to do. And this includes climate change, this includes a whole host of areas. Then there is this whole issue of multilateral power. I look at Europe and I see what is happening on the Ukraine war, and it's a joke, but I wonder if it's really a joke. Does Europe have a foreign policy anymore, or is it just following what the US wants? And the US has this war doesn't cost the US very much. So because it has its oil, defense industries are heavily in demand, producing for the war. So in a sense, it is, we are in a situation where the international community that many of us look to are actually just not available to render us the kind of support that we could have expected earlier. China and India are the new fulcrum points. But here also, there was a dialogue that I attended, not in virtual dialogue, because this is the first time I've come to Pakistan in many years. And it was, I will not say who it was, because you all know the person. He's a Pakistani public intellectual. And the question he was asked by an Indian journalist was that, you have Pakistan's was greatly strengthened by its geostrategic value in terms of its location because of Afghanistan, because of the Taliban, because of being a frontline state. Now that rental value, and the phrase used was a very pejorative phrase, that rental value is not there, what will happen to Pakistan? And the person said, and he smiled and he said, you don't know what will happen with India and China. If that happens, Pakistan's rental value will again be valuable again. So, in a sense, we are in a situation of great flux. What I'm saying is that in the foreign offices of our countries, there is a lot of rethinking that's going on. South Asia has suddenly become extremely important for, in fact, the international community. Partly it is India, because India is in a what they call a very sweet position. It speaks to China. It speaks to Russia. It speaks to it can speak to the Ukraine and to the Western world as well. So, in a sense, it's not neutrality, but it's ambivalent ambiguity is, in fact, placing it in a position of power. And so there is a lot of wooing of India. I'm not even going into what is happening internally and the fact that it's no longer considered even to be a real democracy in terms of international indexes on what is democracy. But the important thing is that this is a moment where India feels that it is actually a rising power. It is the ascendant power. Ascendant powers need to secure their geopolitical situation. They need to have good engagements and intensive engagements with their neighbors. If our state governments, if our political parties are thinking like this, why is it that we in civil society are no longer really active on this front? I mean, there was one session on food security and livelihood, what Sri Lanka and what Pakistan can learn from each other. I mean, there is so much that is possible. Yes, the India-Pakistan axis is a major problem, but where is the problem in terms of at least beginning that re-engagement? There was a time when I'm going to close with this. There was a time when there was a great deal of regional thinking. How are you going to solve your minority problem without looking at it regionally, particularly since South Asia is a kin state system where the minority in one place is a majority in the other? Refugees, all these require regional thinkings. Where is the civil society response? Why is it that our states are thinking much faster than we are? And why are we in civil society lagging behind about, once again, South Asian networking? And this time, there won't be any donors really to support us. We will have to do it ourselves. Thank you. Sorry.